and welcome back to my channel. Bonsoir et re-bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Muriel. May is Mental Health Awareness Month, as I've recently learned, though I had an inkling that was what it was. And as such, this presents me with the opportunity of making 3 different videos talking about different books I have and which I can recommend on the topic of mental health / mental illness more specifically, because it's obviously a subject that's fairly near and dear to my heart in a way, because I myself suffer from mental illness, and allows me to talk about a few books I have in my library and which I otherwise wouldn't have the opportunity of talking about in other videos. So I'll be making 3 such videos. The first video, this one, will talk about basically memoirs about mental illness, whether in prose or graphic format. In the second video, I will be talking about a very specific subject, which at first glance you might wonder, what the hell has this got to do with mental health? But I'll explain in more detail in that video. It'll be about psychedelic medicine, basically. And the third video will just me going through all the books I have, talking about the subject of sexual trauma, because sexual trauma has a very heavy impact on mental health. I said mental illness more specifically, so May is Mental Health Awareness Month. I personally would like to focus in more on mental illness. Very quickly, I would just like to touch upon just a minor pet peeve of mine, or maybe not so minor. I do acknowledge that mental health is something which concerns everyone. You should care about your mental health just as you care about the way you eat, the way you exercise, the way you sleep, reducing stress, taking care of yourself, etc., etc. However, I tend to see, I guess, in broader media, in the broader conversations we have in society, that mental illness, actual mental illness, tends to get folded in just average mental health concerns for people. Basically, I feel like true mental illness isn't really talked about as much and is still very much stigmatized. There are lots of myths surrounding mental illness, and instead we talk about mental health, reducing stress and not being depressed, but you're not actually talking about things like depression or anxiety disorders. I don't know, especially with the pandemic, I've seen just a lot of these kinds of conversations, and it kind of rubs me the wrong way, because it's just not quite the same thing to have a bit of a depletion in your overall mental health and actually suffering from, well, a neuropsychiatric condition, sometimes having done so for years of your life, as is my case. I guess I just want to emphasize that I'm interested more in mental illness as an actual condition, as a disorder, something you have to live with every day of your life for several years. Now, of course, mental illness proper can affect a lot of people, and it does, and mental illness can develop from a basic depletion in mental health, as has happened sadly with the pandemic. So I really am not trying to minimize this. I'm not trying to gatekeep mental illness. Not at all. I'm just saying that sometimes I feel like there's a bit of nuance that is just missing in the conversation, and people with serious mental illness end up, well, not benefiting from this. We still end up with the stigma and the misunderstanding and the bad ideas circulating about mental illness. This must have been very confusing. I'm sorry, I've tried to be clear about this. I had a hard time putting my thoughts into words there. Also, before I get into the panel of books I'm going to present, perhaps a little note on my own history and experience with mental illness. I have suffered from basically chronic depression and a couple of anxiety disorders since I was about 10, 11 years old. So I've lived now most of my life with mental illness. Now, of course, I've had periods where it was a bit better, I've had flare-ups. I'm going through a flare-up of mental illness and have been going through it for the past 18 months. It sucks. It's not something that's pleasant. That's also something that I feel like sometimes does happen also in broader media. There's a bit of a glamorization of mental illness, but then of course, only certain kinds of mental illness, like what used to be called the neurotic kinds of mental illnesses, so depression, anxiety, never something like bipolar or schizophrenia. Another conversation for another day. Anyway, so yes, I have been hospitalized several times because of said mental illness. The first time I was hospitalized, I was 12 years old. It was for something which is called school phobia, but I mean, basically it's just a very specific type of social phobia. I still have social phobia today, or social anxiety disorder, but I could go back to school, which was the big problem at the time. I've been hospitalized as an adult 2.5 times. The half time is basically me spending time at a day hospital, so not quite the same thing as a regular hospitalization. And as most of you probably know, very recently, so about 2 months ago now, I was at a psychiatric clinic for 3 months between December of 2020 and March of 2021. I'm not, at this point in my life, particularly attached to strict labels, the official diagnoses of like the DSM and company. That's why I just say I have some kind of depressive disorder, and I have social anxiety disorder, probably generalized anxiety disorder, whatever. I'm not that attached to labels anymore, but that general idea of things. Our time, managing emotions, or in certain kinds of emotions. I'm also a self-harmer, not encouraging anyone to do so, by the way. I'm just saying that it's a statement of fact. That's something I struggle with. And yeah, I have also, experienced suicidal ideation, all those nice things. So that's my experience with mental illness. I think it's important to be transparent about it, because that's also what I'm going to talk about the books I need to mention in a minute. I'm not ashamed of these things that are part of me. I don't think anyone should be. It's not because you have a mental illness that you're all crazy, that you're dangerous to other people. Now, some people with mental illness are dangerous, but it's the minority. The vast majority of people with mental illness are vastly more dangerous to themselves and to anyone else. And I still have very good, I think, critical thinking faculties. I can still function in some areas, but mental illness is also disabling in some other areas. And the tricky thing about mental illness, about psychiatric disorders, is that they're not always constantly disabling. They can be, temporarily disabling, which is annoying. It's just annoying. I'll leave it at that. So with that little intro out of the way, and there's no issue whatsoever if you chose to skip that. That's why my future self will have put in a timestamp. So I'm going to talk about basically memoirs, or books that explain the history of psychiatry a little bit. I don't have any books on this list about how to deal with mental illness specifically, primarily because I've never really read a book like that. I have read a couple, but they never were satisfactory to me. I never got any use out of them. I do have a book about, a book that critiques modern contemporary psychiatry, but that it doesn't really fit into what I want to talk about here. So I primarily have memoirs. I have memoirs in prose form and memoirs in graphic novel form. I'll be talking about books in both English and French. I cannot guarantee that any of the books are translated in the other language, so you'll just have to take them as they come. So first, I'm just going to mention books which I no longer have in my library, but they might still be of interest to some of you. So first, I'll mention An Unquiet Mind by Dr. K. Redfield Jamison. This is the author's memoir of her experience with bipolar type 1, so bipolar disorder characterized by episodes of depression and mania. In her case, mania that even veered into actual psychosis. Some of the stuff she describes is fairly terrifying, actually. And she's also, I said doctor, I can't remember if she herself is a psychiatrist or if she's a PhD in psychology. I think she does study the disease which she has, so bipolar disorder. I read this book a long time ago. I don't really remember the ins and outs. I do remember that I found it interesting, informative, quite moving, because, her experience with bipolar seemed pretty bad. That being said, I have also read comments. Some people find that it's too bleak or too depressing, that there isn't much hope in that book, that if you're a person recently diagnosed with bipolar and you read this, you might feel very dispirited by what you read, because it paints a very, very bleak picture of the disease. I can't really say whether I agree or not. I just don't remember the book well enough to comment on that, so keep that in mind if you're thinking about checking it out. And I'll also mention, I'm actually not quite sure if I still have it in my library, but if it is in my library, it's stuck behind another row of books and I just couldn't be bothered to take it out. Sorry. One day I'll do a bookshelf tour, but it's just going to be a bitch to film because all of my shelves are double shelved. It's going to be a mess. Whatever. Cross that bridge when I get to it, right? So I want to mention Le Pavillon des Enfants Fous by Valérie Valère. I think that author ended up committing suicide. That's a very short memoir in French about the author's experience with anorexia and being hospitalized on on a children's psychiatric ward, which is why I chose to read it at the time, which again was several years ago now, because I've been hospitalized on a children's psychiatric ward. In fact, so this is the funny thing, little anecdote. So the first time I was hospitalized at the children's hospital, there was a patient there, a young anorexic girl, and she referred to our unit because sometimes we'd go out for like a shopping activity during which we would buy ingredients with which to cook later on anyway. And she would call us le Pavillon des Enfants Fous, so the pavilion of crazy children. It really stuck in my head, and then I found this memoir and I was like, so did she get that expression from that book? I'm assuming she did anyway. I mildly enjoyed that memoir, I guess. I mean, the portrait the author paints of that children's psychiatric ward is very bleak, very depressing. It seemed like an old school style of psychiatric ward with like white tiling and just patients being treated like shit, even, child patients, which thankfully was not my experience. Now, I don't have that fond memories of the children's hospital for several different reasons, but it was clearly not as bad as what is described in that memoir. And of course, the author talks about her experience with anorexia, though once again, I don't really quite remember the ins and outs of that. I have experience living alongside anorexic patients, especially, the psychiatric clinic, which I stayed at recently and which I'd stayed at 3 years ago. The unit on which I stay is a unit specializing in eating disorders, even though that's not one of my problems, thankfully. So I'm familiar with that problem, even though I don't suffer from it myself. So again, I don't really remember that much about the memoir, but it's a memoir I can, I guess, recommend if you're curious about those kinds of experiences. So now moving on to the books I know for a fact are still in my library. So I'm going to start with the prose memoirs or novelized memoirs. Some titles you will have heard of because they're just references by this point, right? But still, I'm going to mention them. So we have Girl Interrupted by Susanna Kaysen. Apologies if I botched her name. It's the novelized memoir of the author's experience with mental illness and being committed to a psychiatric ward for young women, the other women she meets there, and she just kind of talks about that. They also made a movie of this book featuring Angelina Jolie and Winona Ryder. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the movie they made of it, and I enjoyed the book because I could relate to, a lot of what the author describes and goes through. Now, once again, I'd say there are like more colorful characters in her book than I've ever encountered in my own experiences of being on a psychiatric ward. I guess it fits a bit more the stereotypical image I think a lot of people still have about psychiatric wards, which is fine because, it was the author's lived experience, but there are lots of different kinds of experiences with psychiatric wards, I'll say that. She based the book on her own files of her being admitted to a psychiatric ward. I can't remember what her issues were exactly, borderline personality disorder, or maybe she was just a bit rebellious and sent to a psychiatric ward so she wouldn't cause too much trouble. But I think she does acknowledge that she had issues. Once again, I read this a few years ago now, but I remember enjoying it, and it survived my big axing of books that I did like a month ago, so there's a reason why it did, and it's because it's a good book. I would recommend it. But then I think this one is even more of a stereotype when you talk about books dealing with depression and mental illness and recommending such books. It's obviously The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. And, guess what? It's a stereotype for a reason, I guess, because this was a brilliant novel. It really impacted me quite a bit when I read it, which was about 5 years ago. I think the things she says about depression just rang very true for me. This whole image of being trapped under a bell jar felt very true to me. And, there's also comment about being a woman in a world that isn't always that friendly to women. So I think there's a bit commentary regarding gender and how gender dynamics affect mental health. And that's a very important topic as well. And her experience on a psychiatric ward. Now, she goes through ECT, I believe. Actually, her experience on the psych ward isn't that horrible. You can compare it to something like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which I also have, but I'm not going to talk about because that's just, it's a novel based on some of the experiences of the author, but it's primarily a novel, not a memoir. What happens in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is much more negative than what happens in here, though it's still more of like old school psych wards than what I've been familiar with so far. But in any case, I would definitely recommend this one. I guess especially if you're a young woman, So I think the experience is translatable for a man. It's an experience of depression and just feeling at odds with the world, feeling like you don't belong, and like life is pain and you want the pain to stop. Obviously, all of this is pretty heavy subject matter because we're talking about mental illness and feeling suicidal and feeling in pain and things like that. So obviously, don't read this if you're not in the right frame of mind. And then this is just a straight up memoir. So we have Prozac Nation by Elizabeth Wurtzel. Again, this is kind of a running theme. Apologies for that. I read this a while ago. I don't remember all the details, but this talks about the author's experience with depression specifically, and then her relationship with SSRIs, basically. One of the most famous being Prozac. Yes, I myself have taken Prozac. Did jack shit for me, basically. I'm not a fan of SSRIs, but they do work for some people, so, good for them. It's subtitled Young and Depressed in America because she's a young woman and deals with quite severe depression, goes to see a doctor. I think she does go also to psychiatric hospital at some point and is prescribed antidepressants. And so she does talk at length about her treatment, the downsides of them, but also what she perceives as the benefits of them. And once again, I kept this book, which means I enjoyed it, though undoubtedly it would benefit from a reread, but I could also confidently recommend it. I think it's a worthwhile read. And then the most recent memoir I read about subject of mental illness, depression in particular, it's Darkness Invisible by William Styron. I talked about this at some length in my most recent monthly reading wrap-up, but I'll reiterate that this was beautifully written for one, which means this allowed the author to brilliantly express what it's like to live with and battle with depression. In the author's case, a very severe episode of acute depression. Now, I personally have a more chronic form of depression because I've had it basically since I was a tween, but otherwise, extremely relatable. The way he describes depression just hit me like a ton of bricks because I was like, yup, you nailed it. Absolutely 100% nailed it there. He talks about depression being a type of brainstorm and just all of your emotions being hijacked and going whack. And his depression even veering into pseudo-psychotic territory, and I've also experienced something similar, and how it affects your self-esteem, and just how there aren't quite the right words to even explain what depression is, and it's super bloody difficult sometimes to explain what it is you feel when you feel like shit. Like you say, you feel like shit, but what does that actually mean? It means something, it means something because you feel it, but then translating that into words another person can understand, that is fucking difficult. Believe me, it's very bloody difficult. So and this is extremely short. It's 85 pages. You can read this in a sitting. I thought it was brilliant. Not perfect, of course, but I would highly, highly recommend this memoir. Out of all of the memoirs that I've talked about so far, if you only have to pick one, I would go with this one, and then perhaps The Bell Jar. But this one definitely. It's so short, and it's just very well written. Just a brilliant depiction of what it's like to experience depression. Now going to move on to graphic novel/graphic memoirs. First, a quick little note about this one, Hyperbole and a Half by Allie Brosh. This I also talked about in my January reading wrap-up, I believe, because I read this just at the end of 2020 when I was on the psych ward. So it was fairly apt, I think. This doesn't just talk about mental illness, which is why I just want to quickly mention it, but there is a chapter or a couple of chapters in this collection of vignettes about the author's life and thoughts on things, about depression and anxiety, which are things that the author still struggles with. And it's absolutely brilliant because it's at the same time extremely funny and extremely poignant, and once again just rings very painfully true. And it was brilliant. It's an extremely simplistic art style. Glorified doodles is what I would call them, and yet, see, this little figure is basically the author. She gives this little figure the most amazing facial expressions. And so when she talks about depression, it's just, I'm sorry I'm repeating myself, apologies, but it's brilliant. It's very funny, absurdly funny, I would say. But then it's just very deep as well. It's quite strange, but it's such an original way of talking about the subject and of delivering her thoughts about the subject. And I guess it helps because it's such an effing pain to deal with depression. Being able to laugh about it is a gift. It's a skill too, which you can cultivate. But yeah, it's nice sometimes, you know. So I would definitely recommend this in general because I think it's really hilarious, but especially for the little bits about mental illness. And so the next 3 graphic memoirs, they basically all deal with bipolar disorder, broadly speaking. The reason I got into this subject is because I was misdiagnosed with bipolar 2 for a while. I don't think the diagnosis applies to me at all, but whatever, doesn't matter. In any case, I got interested in the subject and so I read a bit about it. So I have 3 memoirs. Basically, so I'm just going to talk quickly about them. They cover the 3 main different kinds of bipolar disorder. 2 of them are in French, 1 is in English. So first we have Goupil by Lubie. You might recall that I talked about another graphic novel which was, well, partially done by this author, which was La fille dans l'écran, which was one of my favorite graphic novels of 2020. So this is the author's graphic memoir about her experience with cyclothymia, not entirely sure how you pronounce the thymia, anyway, which is like the mildest form of bipolar disorder. So you do have cyclical mood swings, but they're a lot milder than actual mania or even hypomania. It's still disabling to some extent, and it's still a pain to deal with, presumably, if you have it. The author explores the subject of cyclothymia through her own experience with it and, you know, learning about the condition, and she also compares it with the 2 other main kinds of bipolar disorder. And what's kind of cute is that she describes her cyclothymia, apologies if I'm not pronouncing that correctly, okay? She describes it as a little fox, because in French, goupil is like an old French folkloric way of saying fox. So a goupil is a fox. So basically she describes her disorder as a little fox, and then she says bipolar 2 is like, basically like a wolf, and then bipolar 1 is like a dire wolf, this ginormous beast with those massive mood swings. I really like the author's style. It's all done in black, orange, and white, and it's interesting. It gives you information about the disorder and what it's like to live with it. Then there's Le Journal d'une Bipolaire by Emilie et Patrice Guillon. So basically a father-daughter pairing who decided to write this graphic memoir. It deals with Emilie Guillon's experience with bipolar 2 disorder, talks about suicidal episodes, going on the psych ward, and just the time it takes for her to actually get a diagnosis of bipolar 2 and what she and her family do to deal with it and find ways to cope with the illness and live with it, etc. And then the final graphic memoir called Marbles, Mania, Depression, Michelangelo and Me by Ellen Forney. And so this is about the author's experience with bipolar disorder type 1. So that's like the classic bipolar disorder most people are familiar with, maybe? I don't know. Am I overestimating that? I don't know. So having very deep depressive episodes and then episodes of mania where you have hypersexual behavior, spending a lot of money, taking huge risks, and sometimes even veering into like psychotic experiences, as with the experiences described in An Unquiet Mind by Redfield, Jamison, which I mentioned at the beginning of the video. Once again, this was very interesting, very informative and moving, and, you know, I learned things about the disorder, and that's the art style inside. It's the kind of art style which I always tend to enjoy, and yeah, it goes in depth about the author's experience with the disorder. I would definitely recommend all of these memoirs, provided you speak their respective languages, of course. They definitely give good coverage to bipolar disorder as a whole, because they all deal with like different subtypes of the disorder. And then I'm going to conclude the video with 3 additional graphic novels about the subject of psychiatry more generally. So first we have these 2 books, which is HP. HP in French are initials for Hôpital Psychiatrique, so psychiatric hospital. So you have volume 1, which is L'Asile d'Aliénés, and volume 2, Crazy 70s. And this is basically a historical overview of psychiatry, and more specifically, psychiatric hospitals and the treatment, care, or lack thereof, of mentally ill patients from about the 50s to like the 70s and 80s. And I really enjoyed both of these. They were really interesting. Now, they took a close look at psychiatry in France more specifically because these are written in French. But I would definitely recommend them if you speak French, because yeah, they were really interesting and quite moving, because you see what happened to a lot of psychiatric patients in the olden days, which weren't that long ago. And yeah, I mean, a lot of the stereotypes about psychiatric hospitals, unfortunately, are definitely rooted in history and things that have happened. But once again, I can confirm that things have gotten better. Again, not everywhere on earth, not for everyone, sadly. I mean, it also kind of depends on your means in different countries. But I mean, I have been to a psychiatric hospital, to 2 different psychiatric hospitals, and you know, I wasn't bathed in bathtubs full of ice cubes and thrown against a wall and with like hydrotherapy and shit. I mean, that's 19th century stuff. I wasn't lobotomized or electrocuted against my will. Like, that belongs in the past, at least in other places. So that's an improvement, and we should celebrate these kinds of improvements. Definitely check these out if you're interested in like the history of psychiatry and the care in psychiatric hospitals. And finally, I'll mention a book which I have parted with, but which I still think might interest some of you on this topic. It's something called Psychiatric Fables by John Cunningham. I still have a book by that author, which is, Darryl Cunningham, my bad. So it's called Super Crash, and it was a very, very good graphic novel about like the 2008 economic crisis, but he also illustrated a graphic novel / memoir about the experiences of people in psychiatric care in England, because he's English. So in the UK, different patients, different experiences in psychiatric care. Not nightmarish things, once again, it's like contemporary modern psychiatric care. It's a very human and empathetic look at the subject. I didn't keep the book because I couldn't relate enough of the stories in the book. However, I do still think it was well done and interesting. So if you have an interest in the subject, I would definitely recommend checking that book out. So that concludes the first of 3 videos I wanted to do to mark Mental Health / Illness Awareness Month. I hope you found it interesting. Added a few books on your TBRs, especially if you yourself suffer from some kind of mental illness and wish to relate to other people's stories in a book form. I'm gonna get on with parts 2 and 3, but for this video, signing off, hoping you all have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Take good care of yourselves. Take good care of your mental health and or mental illness if you are sadly afflicted with such. And I shall see you very quickly in the next video. Bye-bye.